The worst mistake a millionaire ever made was pretending to be poor in front of the one woman who had nothing left to give. The night air over downtown Chicago felt heavy with rain as people hurried past the glowing entrance of the subway station, collars pulled high, footsteps quick and impatient. Among them stood a young woman with tired eyes and a thin coat that did little to stop the cold wind sweeping between the buildings. Her name was Sophia Bennett, and at that moment she was counting the last few dollars left in her wallet under the dim light of a street lamp. $15. That was all she had left in the world after paying for 2 nights at a cheap motel and buying a small cup of coffee that morning. Across the street, traffic lights changed from red to green while horns echoed through the wet city blocks. Sophia tightened her grip on the worn leather wallet and stared down at the thin bills again, as if looking at them long enough might somehow multiply them. It would not. She needed that money for food tomorrow. Maybe for a bus ride to the next job interview she hoped would finally change her luck. She had already been turned away from 3 different places that week. Then she heard the voice. Soft, hesitant, almost embarrassed. "Excuse me, miss." The words were carried by the wind, barely louder than the rumble of the train below the street. Sophia turned and saw a man standing several feet away beneath the same flickering streetlight. His coat looked old and damp from the rain. His hair was slightly messy, and the shadows under his eyes suggested a man who had not slept well in days. He had not looked dangerous. If anything, he looked tired. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Sophia studied the stranger carefully. She had lived in Chicago long enough to know that kindness in the city could sometimes come with consequences. Still, something about the way he stood there made it impossible for her to walk away. His shoulders were stiff from the cold, and his hands trembled slightly as he spoke again. "I'm sorry to bother you. My wallet was stolen earlier tonight. I just need enough money for a train ride home. I promise I will pay it back." For a moment the world around them seemed to pause. A bus roared past, spraying water across the sidewalk, but neither of them moved. Sophia felt the thin bills inside her wallet pressing against her fingers. $15. Her last money. The only thing standing between her and a completely empty tomorrow. She should say no. Every practical thought in her mind told her to keep walking. Yet when she looked into the stranger's eyes, she saw something that felt painfully familiar. Pride fighting with desperation. The same quiet exhaustion she saw in her own reflection every morning. Sophia slowly opened her wallet. The wind tugged at the loose strands of her hair as she pulled out the bills. "This is all I have," she said quietly. The stranger blinked in disbelief as she placed the money into his shaking hands. He looked at the bills as if they were something fragile, something sacred. "Are you sure?" he asked softly. Sophia forced a small smile, even though her stomach tightened with fear about what tomorrow might bring. "I will figure something out," she said. "Just get home safe." What Sophia Bennett did not know in that moment was that the tired stranger standing under the Chicago streetlight was not a desperate man at all. His name was Daniel Whitmore, and he was one of the richest men in America. The train beneath the street rumbled like distant thunder as Sophia Bennett watched the stranger disappear down the stairway that led into the underground station. The damp bills no longer in her hand, the cold wind now feeling sharper against her thin coat. For a long moment, she remained under the flickering street lamp, staring at the empty space where the man had stood only seconds earlier, wondering whether she had just made the kindest decision of her life or the most foolish one. Around her, the city continued its restless rhythm. Cars passed in streaks of reflected light across the wet pavement. A taxi honked somewhere down the block. People hurried past without noticing the quiet exchange that had just taken place. Sophia slowly closed her empty wallet and slipped it back in her coat pocket. The absence of the money felt heavier than the bills themselves had ever felt in her hand. $15 had not been much in a city like Chicago, but tonight it had been everything. She exhaled slowly and began walking toward the small bus stop 2 blocks away, hoping the late bus might still be running. As she reached the corner, she glanced back once more toward the subway entrance. half expecting to see the stranger returning with an awkward smile and the money still in his hand. But the stairway remained empty, swallowed by the yellow glow of underground lights and the distant echo of the train. On the opposite side of the street, a dark sedan was parked quietly along the curb. Inside the vehicle, a man in a tailored coat sat behind the steering wheel watching the entire scene through the rain-dotted windshield. His name was Michael Grant, the chief security advisor for Daniel Whitmore, and he had followed his employer through the city for most of the evening after Daniel insisted on leaving the office alone without the usual protection that surrounded one of the wealthiest men in America. Michael had seen many strange things while working for powerful people, but watching a young woman hand over her last money to a man she believed was homeless had left him momentarily speechless. He reached for the small communication device in his ear and spoke quietly. "Mr. Whitmore, are you safe?" The response came several seconds later through the faint crackle of the line as Daniel Whitmore stood deep within the subway station, watching Sophia walk away above ground. "Yes," Daniel said softly, his voice thoughtful rather than relieved. "I am safe. Did you see what just happened?" Michael looked through the windshield again as Sophia disappeared around the corner, her small figure swallowed by the long stretch of wet sidewalk. "I saw everything," he replied. "She gave you the money without hesitation." Daniel remained silent for a moment as the train roared into the station beside him, wind rushing along the platform. For weeks, he had been moving through the city without his usual identity, wearing ordinary clothes, speaking to strangers, observing the lives of people who would never recognize the name Daniel Whitmore on a financial news broadcast. He had told his board that he needed time to understand why the charitable projects his company funded sometimes failed to reach the people they were meant to help. But tonight had revealed something he had not expected to find: kindness that asked for nothing in return. She said it was all she had, Daniel murmured quietly. Michael nodded to himself inside the car. Then she is either very brave or very reckless. Daniel Whitmore stepped onto the train as the doors opened and passengers began filing inside. Through the window, he caught a final glimpse of the street above through the metal grating of the station entrance. Somewhere out there, a young woman named Sophia Bennett was walking into the night with an empty wallet and no idea that the man she had helped was not a stranger in need at all. Daniel closed his eyes briefly as the train door slid shut and the cars began to move through the tunnel. "Find out everything about her," he said calmly into the small microphone clipped beneath his collar. Michael straightened in his seat inside the parked sedan. "Everything, sir." "Yes," Daniel answered as the train accelerated into the darkness beneath Chicago. Her name, where she works, where she lives, and why someone who has nothing left would still choose to give everything away. The next morning, the gray light of dawn slipped slowly through the cracked blinds of a small room on the third floor of an aging apartment building on the north side of Chicago. Sophia Bennett stirred beneath a thin blanket on a narrow bed that creaked softly as she sat up and rubbed the sleep from her tired eyes. For a moment, she forgot about the night before. Then the memory returned all at once. The subway station, the stranger, the $15 she had placed into his trembling hands. Sophia reached into the pocket of her coat, hanging over the back of a chair, and opened her wallet again as if the bills might somehow have returned during the night. The wallet was empty except for a faded photograph of her younger self standing beside her mother outside a small house that had been sold years ago. She stared at the photograph for a moment before closing the wallet gently. Outside the window, the city was already waking up. The distant sound of traffic rolled along the street below, while the smell of fresh coffee drifted faintly from the diner on the corner. Sophia stood and moved across the small room that barely held a bed, a dresser, and a narrow table that served as both desk and kitchen counter. Her phone buzzed softly on the table. The screen showed a reminder she had set 2 days earlier. Job interview at 10 in the morning. Do not be late. Sophia took a deep breath and glanced at the clock above the door. She had enough time to walk nearly 2 miles to the bus line that would take her downtown. Normally, she would have used the subway, but without money for a train ticket, that option was gone. She washed her face in the small sink and pulled on the cleanest clothes she owned, A simple blue shirt and dark pants that had been carefully pressed the night before in preparation for the interview, she hoped would finally change her luck. As she left the apartment building, the cold morning air hit her cheeks, and she wrapped her coat tighter around her shoulders before beginning the long walk toward the bus stop. The streets of Chicago stretched endlessly ahead of her, lined with brick buildings and storefronts that were just beginning to open for the day. Every step reminded her that the money she had given away had been meant for transportation and breakfast. Now she had neither. Still she kept walking. Meanwhile, across the city, inside a tall glass tower overlooking Lake Michigan, Daniel Whitmore stood near the wide window of his office watching the early sunlight reflect off the water. The room around him was quiet except for the soft hum of climate control and the distant murmur of employees arriving on the floors below. Michael Grant stepped inside, carrying a tablet filled with information gathered during the night. "I found her," he said calmly. Daniel turned from the window. "Her name is Sophia Bennett, 25 years old. Works part-time at a small restaurant called Harbor Street Grill. Lives in a rented room on the north side of the city." Michael hesitated for a moment before continuing. "According to the records, she is behind on rent and has been applying for other jobs for weeks." Daniel listened silently as he absorbed the details. On the screen of the tablet, a photograph appeared showing Sophia leaving her apartment building only minutes earlier, walking quickly along the sidewalk with determination in her step. "She gave away the last money she had," Michael added quietly. Daniel studied the photograph carefully. She did not hesitate. Outside on a busy downtown street, Sophia finally reached the bus stop just as a long line of commuters formed along the curb. She searched her pockets again, even though she already knew the answer. When the bus arrived, the driver opened the door and passengers began climbing aboard one by one. Sophia stepped forward and then paused, realizing she had nothing to offer for the fare. The people behind her shifted impatiently. After a moment, she stepped aside and watched the bus pull away, its engine rumbling down the street while she remained standing on the sidewalk alone. Far above the city, Daniel Whitmore lowered the tablet slowly. "Then we help her," he said quietly. Michael looked at him with curiosity. "How?" Daniel's eyes remained fixed on the photograph of the young woman walking through the cold morning air. "Not yet," he replied calmly. "First, I want to see what someone like her does when the world gives her nothing back." The cold wind moved through the streets of Chicago as Sophia Bennett continued walking downtown after the bus disappeared without her, the sound of its engine fading into the noise of morning traffic while she adjusted the strap of her worn bag and kept moving forward with quiet determination. The sidewalks were crowded with people rushing toward offices, coffee shops, and train entrances, yet Sophia moved at a slower pace, conserving energy because she had not eaten since the small cup of coffee she bought the day before. Nearly 2 miles later, the tall glass building where her job interview was scheduled finally appeared ahead of her, its polished entrance reflecting the pale winter sunlight. She paused across the street for a moment, catching her breath before crossing through the busy intersection. Inside the lobby, the warmth of central heating wrapped around her as she stepped onto the clean marble floor. The building smelled faintly of fresh polish and expensive perfume, and employees in pressed suits walked confidently toward elevators while speaking quietly into phones. Sophia approached the reception desk where a well-dressed woman looked up from a computer screen. "Good morning," Sophia said politely, trying to steady her breathing after the long walk. "I am here for the 10 in the morning interview with Lakeshore Marketing." The receptionist glanced at the clock mounted on the wall behind her and then back at Sophia with a professional but distant expression. "I am sorry," she replied calmly. "The interview started 15 minutes ago." Sophia felt her stomach tighten. "I walked here as fast as I could," she explained softly. "Is there any chance I could still speak with the manager?" The receptionist hesitated before checking the computer again. After a brief pause, she shook her head gently. The manager had another meeting scheduled immediately after. "You can submit your information online, and they may contact you again." The words were spoken kindly, but they carried the quiet finality of a door closing. Sophia nodded with a small, polite smile, even though disappointment weighed heavily in her chest. "Thank you for checking," she said before turning away from the desk and walking slowly back toward the glass doors. Outside, the wind felt colder than before. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching the steady flow of cars and buses that moved through the city without ever slowing down for people like her. A delivery truck rolled past while the smell of grilled onions drifted from a street food cart on the corner, making her realize just how empty her stomach felt. Sophia reached into her bag and pulled out the folder that held her resume, the edges slightly bent from the long walk. The same folder she had carried to 3 other interviews in the past 2 weeks. For a moment, she wondered if giving away her last money the night before had been foolish after all. Yet when she remembered the tired eyes of the stranger standing beneath the streetlight, she felt the same quiet certainty she had felt in that moment. Helping someone had still been the right thing to do. Several miles away in the upper floors of Daniel Whitmore headquarters, Michael Grant stood beside the large office window while watching a live feed on the tablet he held. The camera showed Sophia leaving the building she had just entered, her shoulders slightly lowered, but her steps still steady as she walked down the sidewalk. She missed the interview, Michael reported calmly. Daniel Whitmore stood behind his desk with his hands resting lightly against the polished wood surface. He studied the image on the tablet with careful attention. Does she know we are watching? No, Michael replied. She believes she simply missed her opportunity. Daniel nodded slowly. And yet she keeps moving forward. Michael looked again at the screen as Sophia approached the street food cart, but paused when she realized she had no money to pay. She thanked the vendor politely and continued walking instead. Daniel's eyes followed the movement on the screen. A person who has nothing left and still chooses kindness, he said quietly, is a person the world should never overlook. Michael raised an eyebrow slightly. Should I step in now? Daniel shook his head slowly. Not yet. Let's see how far her strength carries her when she believes no one is watching. The afternoon light stretched across the streets of Chicago as Sophia Bennett continued walking without a clear destination, the tall buildings casting long shadows across the sidewalks while the cold wind brushed against her cheeks. The city was alive with movement around her, yet she felt strangely invisible among the thousands of people passing by. Businessmen hurried toward meetings. Tourists paused to photograph the skyline, and street musicians played soft melodies that echoed through the concrete corridors of downtown. Sophia slowed her pace near a public park where bare winter trees stood silently beside iron benches. Her legs ached from the mile she had walked since morning, and the emptiness in her stomach had turned into a dull ache that followed each breath she took. She sat carefully on one of the benches and opened the folder containing her resume once more, smoothing the edges with her fingers as if determination alone could repair the opportunities that had slipped away. Across the park, a group of office workers laughed while carrying takeout containers filled with warm food, and the smell drifted across the open space. Sophia looked away quietly, reminding herself that frustration would not help her situation. Instead, she closed her eyes for a moment and focused on the simple promise she had made to herself years ago after her mother passed away. No matter how difficult life became, she would never allow bitterness to replace kindness. At the same time, several miles away inside the private conference room on the top floor of Whitmore Industries, Daniel Whitmore sat at the head of a long polished table while several executives discussed the company's upcoming expansion plans. Charts were projected across a large screen showing numbers and forecasts. Yet Daniel's attention drifted back again and again to the tablet resting beside his hand. The device displayed a quiet live update from Michael Grant, who continued observing Sophia's movements throughout the city. After a moment, Daniel lifted the tablet and glanced at the most recent image. Sophia Bennett sitting alone on a park bench, shoulders slightly hunched against the wind, her resume folder resting in her lap. One of the executives paused during his presentation when he noticed Daniel's gaze focused elsewhere. Is everything all right, sir? The man asked carefully. Daniel lowered the tablet and offered a calm nod. Continue, he replied politely. The meeting resumed, but the numbers on the screen no longer held his attention. Instead, he found himself thinking about the quiet strength in Sophia's posture when she had given away the last money she possessed without hesitation. For someone who had spent his life surrounded by wealth and calculated decisions, the simplicity of that moment had unsettled him in a way he could not ignore. Hours later, the meeting finally ended, and the executives gathered their papers before leaving the room one by one. Michael Grant entered quietly after the door closed behind the last of them. "She has not eaten all day," Michael reported in a low voice. Daniel stood and walked toward the window overlooking the city. Below them, the streets stretched endlessly, filled with lives moving in different directions. "Where is she now?" Daniel asked. Michael glanced down at the tablet again. "Still in the park. She has been there nearly an hour." Daniel remained silent for several seconds as he watched a line of clouds drift slowly over the lake in the distance. Finally, he turned back toward Michael. "Arrange something simple," he said calmly. "Nothing obvious. Just enough so that she believes the world has not forgotten her completely." Michael raised an eyebrow with curiosity. "And after that?" Daniel's expression softened slightly as he thought about the quiet determination in Sophia's eyes the night before. "After that," he replied, "we give her the opportunity she deserves to create her own future." Meanwhile, in the park, Sophia Bennett slowly stood from the bench and took a deep breath of the cold afternoon air before gathering her resume folder and continuing down the path toward the city streets once more, unaware that far above the skyline a man who had once been a stranger beneath a streetlight had begun quietly changing the direction of her life. The late afternoon sun slowly lowered behind the skyline of Chicago as Sophia Bennett stepped back onto the busy sidewalk after leaving the quiet park, the cold wind brushing lightly against her face while the city lights began flickering on one by one. She walked with steady determination, even though exhaustion weighed on every step she took. The streets had grown louder as rush hour approached, and long lines of cars crawled through the intersections while office workers hurried toward train stations and bus stops. Sophia kept moving forward, holding her resume folder carefully against her coat, as if protecting the last fragile piece of hope she still carried. After several blocks, she noticed a small neighborhood cafe tucked between two larger buildings. Warm yellow light glowed through the windows, and the smell of fresh bread drifted into the street. For a moment, she considered walking past it, knowing she had no money for even the smallest meal, but the warmth inside the shop pulled her toward the door almost without thinking. When she stepped inside the cafe, the quiet sound of soft music and gentle conversation filled the room. A few customers sat at wooden tables drinking coffee, while a young barista worked behind the counter. Sophia approached slowly and looked at the menu hanging on the wall, though she already knew she could not order anything. She hesitated for a moment before turning to leave, but just as she reached the door, the barista called out to her. "Excuse me, miss." Sophia turned back with a confused expression. "Yes." The barista held out a small paper bag with a warm smile. "Someone paid for this earlier and asked that it be given to the next person who looked like they needed it." Sophia blinked in surprise. "For me." The barista nodded gently. "Fresh bread and soup. Is still warm." Sophia accepted the bag slowly, her hands trembling slightly from both hunger and gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. Outside again, she sat on a nearby bench and opened the bag carefully. Inside was a simple container of vegetable soup and a piece of warm bread wrapped in paper. Steam rose gently into the cold air. She took the first bite slowly, closing her eyes for a moment as warmth spread through her body. What she did not know was that across the street, a dark sedan remained parked quietly beside the curb. Inside the vehicle, Michael Grant watched the scene through the windshield while speaking softly into a small communication device. "She received the food," he reported. Daniel Whitmore's voice answered calmly from the other end of the line. "And her reaction?" Michael glanced at Sophia again as she continued eating slowly, careful not to waste a single bite. "Grateful," he replied. "She believes it was meant for anyone who needed it." There was a short silence before Daniel spoke again. "Good. Let her believe that kindness still exists in the world without expecting anything in return." Michael leaned back slightly in the driver's seat while continuing to observe the quiet scene unfolding outside. She still has no idea that the man she helped is watching over her now. Daniel's voice softened slightly as he answered. That is the point. Kindness should never feel like a transaction. It should feel like hope appearing when someone least expects it. Across the street, Sophia finished the last spoonful of soup and folded the empty bag neatly before standing once more. The simple meal had not solved her problems, but it had given her enough strength to continue. She looked up at the tall buildings surrounding the street and took a slow breath before beginning to walk again. High above the city, Daniel Whitmore stood near the window of his office watching the evening lights spread across the skyline. Somewhere down there, a young woman who had once handed him her last $15 was continuing her journey without knowing that the world had quietly begun moving in her favor. Daniel's eyes remained fixed on the distant streets as he spoke one final instruction into the phone beside him. Tomorrow, he said calmly, I want to meet Sophia Bennett again. But this time, the meeting will not be an accident. The next morning arrived quietly over Chicago as pale sunlight crept between the tall buildings and spilled onto the cold sidewalks below. Sophia Bennett woke before the city was fully alive, sitting on the narrow bed in her small rented room, while the soft ticking of a cheap wall clock filled the silence. For a moment, she simply listened to the distant sounds of traffic beginning to build outside. The events of the previous day still moved through her thoughts like fragments of a strange dream. The missed interview, the long walk, across the city, the unexpected meal that had appeared just when she needed it most. She tied her hair back slowly and reached for the folder containing her resume, checking it again with careful attention even though she had already memorized every line printed on the paper. Today would have to be different. She could not afford another day without progress. After leaving the apartment building, she began walking toward Harbor Street Grill, the small restaurant where she still worked part-time whenever the manager needed extra help during busy hours. The early morning air was cold enough to sting her cheeks as she moved through the quiet streets, but the city was already waking up around her. Delivery trucks rolled past grocery stores. Commuters hurried toward train entrances. Somewhere a radio played soft music from an open window above the street. When Sophia reached the restaurant, she paused outside the glass door for a moment before stepping inside. The smell of coffee and sizzling bacon drifted through the air while the kitchen lights cast a warm glow across the small dining area. Behind the counter stood the restaurant manager, a broad-shouldered man named Carl Henderson who had owned the place for nearly 20 years. He looked up with mild surprise when he saw Sophia enter earlier than usual. You were here early today, he said while wiping his hands on a clean towel. Sophia offered a polite smile. I was hoping you might need help for the morning shift. Carl studied her face for a moment, noticing the tired shadows beneath her eyes. It has been slow lately, he admitted, but I suppose one extra pair of hands will not hurt. Relief passed through Sophia like a small wave of warmth. Thank you, she said quietly as she tied on an apron and began preparing the table for the first customers of the day. Across the city, inside the upper floors of Whitmore Industries, Daniel Whitmore stood near the long conference table in his private office while Michael Grant entered carrying another report. She returned to the restaurant where she works, Michael said while handing him the tablet. Daniel looked down at the screen where a live image showed Sophia wiping down a table while speaking politely to a customer. She continues to work as if nothing has changed, Michael added. Daniel studied the image carefully. That is exactly why I wanted to see her again, he replied. Michael crossed his arms slightly. You said yesterday that the next meeting would not be an accident. Daniel nodded once. It will not. He walked toward the window where the entire skyline stretched beneath the morning sky. Then he turned back with a quiet decision in his voice. Prepare the car. Michael raised an eyebrow. You're going there personally. Daniel Whitmore allowed a faint smile to appear. Yesterday, she believed I was a stranger who needed help. Today, I want to see whether she still recognizes me when the roles are different. Meanwhile, at Harbor Street Grill, the breakfast crowd had begun filling the small restaurant with quiet conversation and the clatter of plates. Sophia moved quickly between tables carrying coffee cups and menus while the kitchen filled with the smell of eggs and toast. She did not notice the dark luxury sedan pulling slowly to the curb outside. Nor did she notice the tall man stepping out onto the sidewalk, adjusting his coat while looking through the restaurant window toward the young woman who had changed something inside him without even knowing it. Daniel Whitmore paused for a moment before opening the door and stepping inside. The door of Harbor Street Grill opened with a soft chime that blended into the morning noise of dishes clinking and coffee being poured as Daniel Whitmore stepped inside, the warmth of the small restaurant wrapping around him while the smell of fresh eggs and toast filled the air. For a moment he remained near the entrance, quietly observing the room. The restaurant was modest and comfortable, with wooden tables that had been polished so many times that the grain of the wood shone under the ceiling lights. Regular customers sat reading newspapers or speaking softly while drinking coffee. Behind the counter, Carl Henderson moved between the grill and the register with the steady rhythm of someone who had spent half his life inside the same kitchen. Daniel's eyes moved across the room until they found the person he had come to see. Sophia Bennett was carrying 2 plates toward a table near the window, her expression calm and focused even as the morning rush continued building around her. She did not look up as Daniel chose a quiet table near the center of the room and took a seat. A moment later, Sophia approached with a small notepad in her hand. "Good morning," she said politely in the practiced tone of someone who had served hundreds of customers before him. "Can I get you some coffee to start?" Daniel looked up at her and allowed a gentle smile to appear. "Yes, please." Sophia nodded and turned toward the counter without noticing anything unusual about the man sitting at the table. Daniel watched her carefully as she poured coffee into a white ceramic mug and returned a moment later. "Here you go," she said as she placed the cup in front of him. "Would you like to see a menu?" Daniel studied her face quietly for a moment before answering. "I think I will start with breakfast. Eggs, toast, and coffee will be fine." Sophia wrote the order quickly on her notepad. "I will have that ready for you shortly." As she turned to leave, Daniel spoke again in a calm voice. "Miss Bennett." Sophia paused and looked back at him with mild confusion. "Yes." Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. "We met a few nights ago near the subway station." The words hung in the air between them for a moment. Sophia searched his face carefully, her brow tightening as she tried to remember. Then recognition slowly appeared in her eyes. The stranger beneath the streetlight. The man who said his wallet had been stolen. Her voice softened with surprise. "You are the man from the station." Daniel nodded once. "I am." Sophia looked at him with clear disbelief. "You look different now," she said carefully. Daniel could not help but smile slightly at the honesty of the observation. "I suppose I do." Sophia glanced down at her notepad and then back at him again. "I am glad you made it home safely," she said politely. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "I did more than make it home. Because of you." Sophia's expression became uncertain. She remembered the $15 she had given him, the last money she had owned that night. "Did the money help you get home?" Daniel nodded. "It did, and it helped me remember something important as well." Sophia tilted her head slightly, unsure what he meant. Daniel reached into the pocket of his coat and placed a crisp folded bill on the table. It was $15, the same amount she had given him. "I believe. This belongs to you," he said gently. Sophia immediately shook her head. "No, you do not need to return it. I gave it to you because you needed it." Daniel kept the bill resting on the table between them. "And what if I told you that your kindness changed something larger than you realize?" Sophia looked at him carefully, the quiet noise of the restaurant continuing around them while the conversation between them seemed to exist in a separate moment. "I would say that you are exaggerating," she replied honestly. Daniel Whitmore allowed himself a small, thoughtful pause before answering. "Perhaps, but I would still like the opportunity to repay that kindness in a different way." Sophia folded her notepad slowly. "I was only doing what anyone should do." Daniel's eyes held steady warmth as he spoke again. "That is exactly why you deserve to hear what I am about to tell you next." For a few seconds, the quiet restaurant seemed to fade into the background as Sophia Bennett stood beside the table looking at the man in front of her, trying to understand why the brief encounter beneath a streetlight had followed her all the way into her workplace. Around them, the normal rhythm of breakfast continued as plates moved across tables and coffee refills were poured, yet the conversation between them held her full attention. Daniel Whitmore rested his hands calmly on the table while the folded $15 remained between them, untouched. Sophia studied his face again, noticing details she had not seen the night they met. His coat was well-tailored, his posture confident, and the watch on his wrist looked far more expensive than anything a man struggling to buy a train ticket would normally wear. The realization made her narrow her eyes slightly. "I do not understand," she said honestly. "If you needed help that night, why do you seem different now?" Daniel took a slow breath before answering. Because the situation was not what it appeared to be. Sophia crossed her arms lightly, still holding the notepad against her apron. "That sounds like the beginning of a complicated explanation." Daniel allowed a faint smile to appear. "It probably is, but I believe you deserve the truth." Sophia glanced briefly toward the counter where Carl Henderson was speaking with another customer. The restaurant was busy, yet no one was paying attention to their conversation. "All right," she said cautiously. "What truth?" Daniel reached into his coat pocket and removed a simple business card. He placed it beside the folded money and turned it so she could read it. Sophia's eyes moved down to the card, and for a moment her expression remained neutral as she read the printed name. Then the meaning slowly reached her. Daniel Whitmore, Chief Executive Officer, Whitmore Industries. The same name she had seen many times in news headlines displayed on television screens, in waiting rooms and restaurant corners. Her eyes lifted slowly from the card back to his face. "You are joking," she said quietly. Daniel shook his head once. "I am not." Sophia picked up the card carefully, as if it might somehow disappear. The realization made her take a small step back from the table. The man she had believed was stranded and helpless beneath a streetlight was sitting in front of her, wearing the calm confidence of someone used to leading companies and signing contracts worth millions of dollars. "That night you said your wallet had been stolen," she said slowly. Daniel nodded. "That part was true. I left my car and my security team behind because I wanted to spend one evening walking through the city without people recognizing who I was." Sophia looked at him with disbelief. "And you decided to test strangers for money." Daniel's expression became more serious. "No. I did not expect anyone to help me. Most people walked past me without stopping." Sophia lowered the card back onto the table, her thoughts racing. "Then why tell me now?" Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but sincere. "Because you were the only person who chose kindness even when you had nothing to gain from it." Sophia remained silent for a moment while the weight of his words settled around her. She thought about the long walk to the interview she had missed, the empty wallet in her coat pocket, and the quiet meal that had appeared when she needed it most. "Was it you?" she asked slowly. Daniel did not answer immediately, but the slight shift in his expression gave her the answer she needed. "You were watching me," she said with quiet realization. Daniel nodded once. "Only to understand the kind of person you are." Sophia let out a soft breath that held both confusion and disbelief. "I gave you $15, she said. "And now you are telling me you are one of the richest men in the country." Daniel folded his hands calmly on the table. "I am telling you that sometimes the smallest act of kindness reveals the most valuable kind of character." Sophia looked down again at the business card resting beside the folded money. Then she raised her eyes to meet his once more. "All right," she said quietly. "So what exactly happens now?" The quiet question hung between them as the morning noise of Harbor Street Grill continued around the table, forks touching plates and coffee cups clinking softly, while Sophia Bennett waited for the man in front of her to answer. Daniel Whitmore looked at her carefully, as if measuring his words with the same precision he used when negotiating business deals worth millions of dollars. But the expression in his eyes now carried something different, something far more personal than business. "What happens now?" he repeated gently. "That depends on you." Sophia tilted her head slightly, still holding the business card between her fingers. "I do not see how it could possibly depend on me," she replied honestly. "You are the one who owns half the skyline of this city." Daniel smiled faintly at the exaggeration, but did not deny the point. Perhaps that is exactly why it depends on you, he said. Sophia waited silently for him to continue. Daniel leaned forward slightly across the table. When you gave me that money the other night, you did not know who I was, he said calmly. You believed I was a stranger who needed help, and you chose to help anyway, even though it meant giving away the last thing you had. Sophia shifted uncomfortably at the attention. I only did what felt right in that moment. Daniel nodded slowly. That is exactly what impressed me. He gestured lightly toward the small restaurant around them. Every day, I meet people who want something from me. Contracts, investments, opportunities. But very few people show kindness when they believe there will be nothing in return. Sophia looked down briefly at the table, unsure how to respond. After a moment, she said quietly, You still have not answered my question. Daniel sat back in his chair. I would like to offer you an opportunity. Sophia raised an eyebrow with caution. What kind of opportunity? Daniel rested his hands together. Whitmore Industries supports several community programs throughout the city. One of them focuses on helping people find stable work and housing after difficult circumstances. I believe you would be an excellent addition to that program. Sophia blinked in surprise. You want to hire me? Daniel shook his head gently. Not exactly hire you in the traditional sense. I want to give you the chance to help lead a project that helps people who face the same struggles you have faced. Sophia laughed softly in disbelief. I work part-time in a restaurant, and I just missed a job interview this morning because I could not afford the bus fare. Daniel's expression remained calm. Yes, and yet you still gave your last money to a stranger because you believed it was the right thing to do. That is the kind of judgment that cannot be taught in a classroom. Sophia folded her arms slowly. It sounds generous, she admitted, but it also sounds like you are offering help out of pity. Daniel immediately shook his head. Not pity, respect. Sophia studied his face carefully to see if he was joking. He did not appear to be. Even so, she hesitated. I appreciate the offer, she said carefully, but I do not want charity. Daniel leaned slightly closer, his voice steady and sincere. Good, because I am not offering charity. I am offering a chance. The same kind of chance you gave me that night when you trusted a stranger. Sophia glanced down at the business card again. Around them, the restaurant continued filling with customers while Carl Henderson called orders toward the kitchen. After a long pause, Sophia spoke again. And if I say no? Daniel nodded, once as if he had expected the question. Then nothing changes, he replied calmly. You return to your work here. I finish my breakfast and leave. The world continues exactly as it was yesterday. Sophia looked out the window for a moment, watching cars pass along the street. Her life had been predictable for a long time. Small paychecks, missed opportunities, long walks across the city, searching for work that never seemed to appear. Slowly she turned back toward Daniel Whitmore. And if I say yes, she asked quietly. Daniel allowed a small, confident smile to appear. Then we begin building something that neither of us expected to. Find that night beneath a streetlight. The quiet possibility of a new future lingered in the air between them as Sophia Bennett looked at Daniel Whitmore across the small table inside Harbor Street Grill. The sounds of the morning rush continuing around them, while her thoughts moved carefully through everything he had just said. For a long moment she did not answer. She simply studied the man who had once stood beneath a streetlight asking for help like any other stranger in the city. The difference now was that she understood the truth behind the calm confidence in his voice and the steady patience in his posture. Daniel Whitmore was not a man who offered empty promises. When someone like him said an opportunity existed, it meant that doors could open that most people never even knew were there. Yet Sophia also knew something else about herself. She had spent years learning how to stand on her own feet, even when life made that difficult. Accepting help was never easy for someone who had always believed independence was the only thing protecting her dignity. Finally, she spoke again, her voice thoughtful rather than uncertain. If I agreed to this opportunity, what exactly would you expect from me? Daniel seemed pleased by the question. He reached for the coffee cup in front of him and took a slow sip before answering. I expect honesty, he said calmly. I expect the same judgment you showed that night when you decided to help someone without knowing anything about them. And I expect you to remember the kind of struggles that many people in this city face every day. Sophia listened carefully. Daniel continued. The project I mentioned is designed to help people rebuild their lives after financial hardship. It connects job training programs, housing support, and community partnerships that give people a second chance when they need it most. Sophia nodded slightly. That sounds important. Daniel smiled faintly. It is important. But programs like that often fail when they're run only by people who have never experienced real difficulty themselves. Sophia understood the meaning behind his words. You think someone like me would understand those struggles better? Daniel met her eyes. I did not think it. I know it. Sophia looked down at the folded $15 still resting on the table. The money felt symbolic now, like a small bridge between two completely different worlds that had somehow crossed paths. She thought about the years she had spent working double shifts in restaurants, about the apartment she struggled to afford, about the interviews that ended with polite smiles and quiet rejections. Slowly she realized that the chance Daniel was offering was not simply about her future. It was about helping others who were walking the same difficult road she had traveled. Carl Henderson's voice suddenly called from across the restaurant. Sophia, I need another pot of coffee over here. She glanced toward the counter instinctively before looking back at Daniel. Duty was still waiting for her in the familiar form of work and responsibility. Daniel noticed the hesitation and stood from his chair. You do not have to decide this minute, he said calmly. I know it is a lot to consider. Sophia nodded slowly. Yes, it is. Daniel reached into his coat pocket and removed another card, placing it beside the first one. This card contained a direct number to his office. If you decide you want to learn more about the project, call that number. We will arrange a meeting and discuss how you could become part of the program. Sophia picked up the second card and held it carefully. Daniel placed a few bills on the table to pay for his breakfast and then turned toward the door. Before leaving, he paused and looked back at her one more time. The world often overlooks people who do the right thing quietly, he said. But sometimes the right moment appears when we least expect it. Then he stepped outside into the morning light, and the door closed behind him with a soft chime. Sophia remained standing beside the table for several seconds, holding the card between her fingers while the restaurant continued its normal rhythm around her. Somewhere deep inside, she felt the beginning of a decision forming, a quiet understanding that the moment beneath the streetlight had not been the end of a simple act of kindness. It had been the beginning of something far larger than she had ever imagined. For the rest of the morning, Sophia Bennett moved through the restaurant with the same steady rhythm she had followed for years, yet everything felt slightly different now. Each time she carried a plate or refilled a cup of coffee, her mind drifted back to the business. Card resting safely in the pocket of her apron. Daniel Whitmore had already disappeared into the city outside, yet his words remained with her like an echo that refused to fade. By the time the breakfast crowd began to thin and the lunch preparation started in the kitchen, Sophia finally stepped into the small storage room behind the counter to take a brief break. The quiet space smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and fresh bread. She leaned against the wall and slowly removed the card from her pocket, turning it over in her hands while thinking about the unusual path her life had taken during the past 2 days. Only 48 hours earlier, she had been standing beneath a cold streetlight with an empty wallet and no plan for the future. Now, she was holding the contact information of one of the most powerful businessmen in the city, a man who believed she could help lead a project that might change other lives. It felt unreal. She wondered if accepting the opportunity would mean leaving the familiar world she understood for something completely unknown. A few minutes later, Carl Henderson knocked lightly on the door frame. Everything all right back here, Sophia? She quickly slipped the card back in her pocket and nodded. Yes, I just needed a moment. Carl studied her face for a second before giving a friendly shrug. Take the time you need. You have worked harder than anyone here this week. After he returned to the kitchen, Sophia stepped outside through the back door of the restaurant. The afternoon air carried the distant sound of traffic and the smell of food from nearby shops. She sat on a wooden crate near the alley wall and pulled the card from her pocket again. This time she looked at it with a clearer sense of purpose. Daniel had said the choice belonged entirely to her. That meant she had the freedom to walk away and continue living exactly as she had before. But something deep inside her knew that the moment beneath the streetlight had already changed the direction of her life. If kindness truly had the power to open unexpected doors, then perhaps it also carried the responsibility to walk through them. Across the city, inside the upper floor office of Whitmore Industries, Daniel Whitmore stood beside the tall windows overlooking Lake Michigan while Michael Grant reviewed several documents on a nearby table. "Do you believe she will call?" Michael asked after a moment. Daniel remained silent while watching the afternoon sunlight reflect off the water. "I do not know," he replied calmly. People who value independence sometimes hesitate to accept opportunity because they fear losing control of their own path. Michael nodded slowly. "But you believe she is capable of leading the project?" Daniel turned slightly toward him. "I believe she understands something that many executives forget. The value of compassion when no one is watching." At that same moment, Sophia Bennett pulled out her phone and carefully typed the number printed on the card. Her finger hovered above the call button for several seconds as doubt and determination battled quietly in her mind. Then she took a slow breath and pressed the screen. The phone rang once, then twice. When a calm, professional voice answered from the other end, Sophia straightened slightly and spoke with steady confidence. "Hello, this is Sophia Bennett. I was told to call about an opportunity." On the other side of the city, Daniel Whitmore listened as the assistant transferred the call to his office line. A faint smile appeared as he picked up the receiver. "Good afternoon, Sophia," he said. "I was hoping you would decide to call." The phone line remained quiet for a brief moment after Daniel Whitmore spoke, and Sophia Bennett felt her heart beating a little faster as she stood beside the back door of Harbor Street Grill with the afternoon wind brushing lightly against her coat. For the first time in many years, she felt as if the path in front of her was opening toward something larger than the narrow routine she had always known. On the other end of the call, Daniel's voice carried calm confidence. "I'm glad you called, Sophia." She smiled slightly, even though he could not see it. "I spent the entire morning thinking about what you said," she admitted. Daniel waited patiently. Sophia continued, "I realized that when I helped you that night, I did not do it because I expected anything in return. I did it because I believed it was the right thing to do." Daniel answered quietly, "And that belief is exactly what this program needs." Several days later, Sophia walked into the headquarters of Whitmore Industries for the first official meeting about the community project Daniel had described. The tall glass building felt very different from the small restaurant where she had spent most of her working life. Yet Daniel greeted her with the same calm warmth she remembered from the morning they spoke across the diner table. Together, they reviewed the plan for a new initiative designed to help people across Chicago find work training, affordable housing, and long-term stability after facing financial hardship. Daniel listened carefully as Sophia described what she had experienced during her years searching for jobs and struggling to pay rent. Her ideas were practical, direct, and deeply connected to the real challenges many people faced every day. Over the following months, the project slowly grew into something meaningful. Sophia worked alongside a small team of community organizers who partnered with local businesses to create job opportunities for people who had been overlooked by traditional hiring programs. They organized training workshops, transportation support, and temporary housing assistance for families trying to rebuild their lives. The program quickly began helping dozens of people who had once felt invisible in a city as large as Chicago. Daniel often visited the project meetings, but he allowed Sophia to lead most of the decisions. He believed that the person who understood the struggles best should guide the direction of the work. Nearly 1 year after the night beneath the streetlight, the program held a small celebration inside a community center where many of the participants had completed their training and found stable employment. Sophia stood near the front of the room, speaking with several families who had benefited from the program. As the evening continued, Daniel Whitmore stepped onto the small stage and looked out across the room, filled with grateful faces. He spoke briefly about the power of compassion and the importance of recognizing the value of people who are often ignored by society. Then he turned towards Sophia with a quiet smile. "Before we close tonight, He said, "I want to remind everyone how this entire project began." He reached into his pocket and held up a simple folded bill. $15. The room grew quiet with curiosity. Nearly a year ago, a young woman, standing beneath a streetlight, gave this money to a stranger she believed needed help more than she did. She had no reason to expect anything in return. But that moment reminded me that kindness is the strongest foundation for any community. Daniel stepped down from the stage and handed the bill to Sophia. She looked at the small piece of paper with gentle disbelief before meeting his eyes again. Around them the room filled with applause from the people whose lives had been touched by the program she now helped lead. In that moment, Sophia understood something important. The night she had given away her last $15 had not left her with nothing. It had given her the chance to build a future that changed far more lives than her own.